Hey, welcome to this mix review. Not only are we going to be covering the number one issue that I find in independent artists' mixes, also the solution in order to make your mix just huge, we're also going to be covering how to fix a harsh sounding vocal in order to make it sound professional. So all of that in this review and more, so stick around and I'll see you after we play the song, and then we'll dive straight into the review.
Mother mantle of green in mossy blue skirts, pockets of seeds, lichen crown in an oaken weave, hold all the secrets to seasons and dreams. I walk among the elders, listen close to what they know, as their arms touch the stars bright gold. Dark and day are the same, turn the wheels, refrain, as above, so below. Light a candle to gaze, to the north wind, to the south wind, to carry you. Burn juniper and sage, to the east wind, to the west wind, to carry you. All the roots running deep, deep into the unknown. We're connected from blood to stone, as we chisel away all the masks that we've made, as above, so below.
All right, so that was As Above, So Below. So thank you, Ron, for allowing us to tear apart your mix for everyone's benefit. Let's actually start talking about what is incorrect about this mix and how we can actually fix it, move it in the right direction. The very first thing is actually a production element. This is slightly stylistic, so if you don't want to change this, totally fine. If you want to have commercially viable music, something should happen in the first 30 seconds, namely the chorus. If you look at all pop songs, you almost always get to the chorus within 30 seconds. Obviously, there are exceptions, but if there's not something especially vocally happening in the first 30 seconds of the song, people are going to get bored and they're just going to skip the song. If there's nothing happening, I sometimes will listen to a mix and there's no vocals or anything of note really happening in the first 45 seconds, and I kind of wonder, is this just a chill instrumental track? Until I get later in the song, and then all of a sudden a minute, vocals start coming in, and then I realize it's not an instrumental. But that's the initial reaction that I have when I hear some songs like this. And so like this one, obviously I can tell it's building up into something else. And so there are vocals that come in on, at around 20-ish seconds. But at the end of the day, I was getting a little bit bored waiting for the vocals to come in. So I would try to shorten that intro and make something happen right away. This isn't necessarily trying to be a pop track necessarily, but at the same time, if you want to make it more commercially viable, that's one decision that I would have made in the production. Starting a song with vocals is definitely one of the best hooks that you can get in your song, especially if you have an awesome singer. So on to the volume balance. The very first thing I have is guitar solo at 230. If it is a single-tracked guitar, I probably would have panned that to the middle of the mix instead of off to the side. And then I would have also been very intentional about bringing that up. It has a lot of reverb, which is pushing it back in the mix, but I really want that to be front and center, centered inside of the mix, and much louder than it already is. That way I can really tell what's going on inside of the mix. You're directing the listener's attention to what's actually important in the song, which is the solo at that point in time. Drags on a little bit for my tastes, but again, that's personal preference. Okay, and then going back to the beginning of the song, when the drums start to come in around 30 seconds or so let's listen to the drum entrance here.
Forest mother, mantle of green and mossy blue skirts, pockets of sea, lichen crown in an oaken weave hold on.
So you have these really cool reverby drums like boom, God. I almost can't hear it. Wearing headphones, I should be able to hear it pretty well, but it's so quiet in the mix, it doesn't really make the impact that I want it to. If this were my mix, I would bring those up very significant, probably 6 decibels in order to really feel that. Again, because you have so much reverb on it, it's putting it back in the mix and offering this cool stylistic drum part. But without being able to hear it, I don't actually appreciate it. And you have to make those reverb intense items way louder than you think you do in order to really make them stand out inside of the mix. And I think that this song could really benefit from that vibe. Nothing's really happening other than the vocal coming in for a while, and then those drums come in. That should be like the feeling that I get inside of the mix. And honestly, I just don't feel that at this point in time, mostly because those drums are just too quiet. Once we hit the main section, the drums are a little bit better volume-wise, and I can really hear what's actually going on. But the other issue is that your bass is too loud and it's covering up your kick drum. So if you look at the Paz analyzer down here, you can actually see that there's a lot that's being covered up right now.
So
when
below,
right here. Because if I take my EQ here and just start boosting around, you can tell that you've found the places where your kick and bass should belong. But if I just boost this right here and then have it cut right here. So this is basically where your bass and kick are living, right? Your kick's pretty low. And I'm going to make just dramatic cuts, right? So I'm using 6 decibels here. I wouldn't actually do this on your mix bus, but so you can see this. And then listen to your kick and bass now after I enable this. Even that small change does make them a little bit better balance. I might high pass your bass a little bit higher than it is if you have any high pass on it, because it's kind of eating up some of that energy where the kick should really be living down in that really ultra low end around 40 to 50 hertz or so. So that's one change that I would probably make. So that's volume balance. Moving on to sonic balance, beyond what I just already talked about with the kick and bass there, is that so your vocals are too harsh. So let's cover that first. I want to show you exactly the EQ move that I would make on your vocals to just make them sound more modern, because they don't sound bad the way they are, but they do sound very vintage, which I don't think is really serving this vocal as well as it could, because the rest of the song doesn't necessarily sound like the way that I would expect it to. In other words, it's very harsh sounding to me just on first initial listen. In order to fix that, I would want to bring up some of those mids. It's kind of missing some of those around the 1K-ish range, right around here. And you're missing that overall, which actually is due to, I think, your guitar volume needs to come up overall, mentioned on the volume balance, but the guitars are just too quiet. And so they would fill up some of this 1K. So just boosting this on the whole mix sounds really nice because you're missing some of that energy. But on the vocal, I'd also add a top shelf starting probably around 5 kilohertz or so, relatively aggressive with that, just to brighten up that vocal. And then I would also cut out the 3K range. It's too much the way it is. And then I would also do a small boost, probably around 150 hertz or so, because 150 hertz, while your vocal actually doesn't have that much energy down there necessarily, it does help round it out and make it feel really full. And this mix definitely does not sound overly full because your bass is just eating up so much energy in there. All of your other items basically have to get out of the way. And so I feel like you've high passed a lot of things way higher than you should have in order to let your bass live in that kind of 150 hertz region. So there's a benefit to getting everything out of the way, but then there's also a detriment if you go too far in that direction as well. So this is the kind of the changes that I would think about making. Again, these are relatively subtle, like 1 to 2 decibels on each of these in order to get your vocal in the right spot. So let's listen here really quick.
Spells casting well, I see and I know we are light and deep shadow. Words of spells casting well, I see and I know we are light and deep shadow. Spirals on my fingers, rings of a willow as a bow.
Yeah, there's something else here too, probably around the 300, maybe 400 hertz range. There's just a slight build up here as well. So yeah, just making some slight adjustments on your vocal will probably go a long ways in making it sound a bit more clean, and I think it'll help really emphasize that vocal because it's really loud in your mix. And so I want that to be the true center of the mix, and I want that to be put on display as best it possibly can. Making those slight EQ adjustments, a little bit on the 150, a little less 500, a little more 1K, a little less 3K, and a little bit more on the top end. Making adjustments the whole entire way up, but very slight. I think that'll go a long ways in helping that vocal really shine through the mix. The other thing is that your bass is a bit fluffy, is what I have written down here. And I think you're just missing some top end. So mostly around like that 1 to 2 kilohertz range, I would bring the bass up a bit because I think you're over boosting it in the mix because you can't hear the definition of that top end. So if you bring up the top end, you don't have to actually bring it up as much. I constantly find this cycle of they can't hear the bass, so then they boost the 100 hertz region, and then they can't hear the bass still, so then they just bring up the volume. And then there's just this never-ending cycle of like keep boosting and boosting and boosting and boosting, either by EQ or with the volume, and then they end up with the bass that's way too loud. So I find that constantly inside of artists' mixes that I review because it's just so common. And also it's hard to monitor that properly as well, even on headphones. One thing to keep in mind. And then related to that, I would also add a little bit more top end to your kick drum as well. I think there's other issues with the kick drum, and so this isn't the biggest issue, but I might add just another like 3K or something, a little bit at 3K to your kick drum to allow that to cut through the mix a little bit better as well. I think that might be solved though, honestly, if you just take the bass down and then push up the kick just a little bit volume wise. That might actually fix most of those issues because it's really just being hidden by that bass. Sonically, drums are also kind of an issue right now, and it has to do both dynamically and sonically with the drums. Biggest issue with the drums overall is that they are just sound a little bit too clean, and they don't have enough thickness to them to really sound like they should. And they're also very inconsistent dynamically. So this is kind of stepping into the dynamics section as well as the sonic balance, but they both essentially would be solved by the same thing. Your snare, let's start with the snare. So the snare needs a little bit more low end, so the more body to the snare. So if I take my EQ, clear all this out, recall default, and then I just boost it right around probably 200 or so, your snare's gonna sound way more full.
Burn juniper and sage to the east wind, to the west wind, to carry.
Yeah, so I'd probably boost around this like 150 hertz region. That's sounding really nice and making that snare a lot more full and has a little bit more oomph behind it. The snare is dynamically very thick and not very punchy. So I would lean more towards a punchy snare. So back off the attack on your compression a little bit. So it's 30 milliseconds or maybe even 50 milliseconds in order to get more transient power out of the snare, and then add another thickness type compression after that, maybe in parallel. But I would definitely either add some punchy type compression or just adjust the attack on your current compression to get more of that transient out of the snare, help emphasize your snare in a really nice way in this song. Stepping into the dynamic balance, I think all of your drums need some more saturation, distortion, or parallel compression. I don't talk about parallel compression that much because it can be dangerous. If I add a compressor here, and let's just dial in this really quick to something relatively aggressive. So let's do 4:1 ratio, makeup. Yeah, this is probably fine on attack release. This is just for example. I'm not going to spend too much time here.
Sage to the east wind, to the west wind, to carry you.
So obviously this is a pretty extreme compression. What we'll do is then mix it in like 30% or something. So overall we have about 3 decibels of gain reduction overall.
Carry you. Burn juniper and sage to the east wind, to the west wind, to carry you. All the roots running deep, deep into the...
Hear how much more consistent those drums are, and also just full sounding. So it might be a little bit weird because you're hearing a lot more vocal and a lot more bass as well. But just try to listen to the drums specifically when I enable this, because it's going to add so much more just power behind those drums that sounds really nice, even though this isn't necessarily like an in-your-face song that needs lots of drums, but it's really going to just make those a lot more consistent and a little bit more modern sounding, so they fit in the song a lot better and can really stay in their little drum pocket inside of the mix.
Carry you. Burn juniper and sage to the east wind, to the west wind, to carry you. All the roots running.
So I would try something out like this on your drum bus specifically. If that doesn't work or you feel like you need more, then I would also play around with adding some distortion or some additional saturation to your drum bus, just to, again, make that thicker and have more body to the entire drums. I'm also hearing that a lot of an issue inside of the toms. The toms could probably use a little less mid-range, a little bit more top and bottom end, and then also have a lot more distortion on those, especially those just very transitory elements. They almost always sound so good if you just add some additional distortion or saturation to them. So let's get back to the dynamic balance. And this is the biggest issue dynamically that I have with this entire song. Overall, you have a decent amount of dynamics. I feel like if anything, you could use a little bit more dynamic control overall for this one spot, where you have this section here where it feels like it needs to go really big, but instead it just shrinks down. And a lot of it is because your vocal is so loud. When you remove the vocal, all of a sudden your mix feels a lot smaller. So that's part of the issue. But ultimately, I want this section to be the section in your song. So let's listen to it really quick and then kind of tear apart what I would do to fix it. So the first thing is, when it comes in, you have this tail from some pad or something that's kind of on the left-hand side here, and it's really stealing a lot of the emphasis away from the punchy drums and rhythm section here, because I'm listening to this tail and it's louder than the actual drums and guitars that are currently happening. And so it just steals some of the energy away. I would probably just automate that tail off a bit so that the listener isn't distracted by that tail with the rest of the rhythm section. Also, I would just automate this entire section up. So I would just come in here, cut that out, raise it by a good 2 decibels or something. And then the second thing I would do is your piano is really loud comparatively to the rest of the instruments. So I might bring that down a little bit. I know that's the kind of the lead part here. Having that sit back in the mix a little bit is going to actually benefit it quite a bit here, especially because it's panned off to the side. So it's like, you're not really the center of the mix, but it is the lead part. So I would keep it panned. I would just back it off a little bit to just allow basically the entire mix to breathe and punch at the same time. And then also I'd bring up the guitar or whatever you have going on there that's really distorted. I think it's a guitar, really, really weak. Just bump that way up in the mix. One thing that electric guitars specifically do really well is fill out your mix. And so if you want a section that's really big sounding, electric guitars should come up because those just fill out all of the empty space inside of the mix and make it sound huge. And then also it sounds like it's in the center. And so I would pan that off to hard right and hard left. If you don't have two parts there essentially to use, I would actually separate it and use some stereo processing to actually move it to the sides. I'm not a huge fan of this generically, so my number one thing would be go back, get another guitar part, make it stereo so it's actually big. But if you can't, if you don't have access to the same rig or whatever issue that you can't actually do that, then I would go in here and I would add a delay, do a sample delay, milliseconds, just delay it, between 10 and 20 milliseconds or so, creates the stereo image. Granted, this is the entire mix. I would never do this, but on the guitar itself. And then the second thing I would do is on the pitch, shifter, dual mono. So then on the left, I would go down by, maybe 10 cents. And on the right, I would go up maybe 10 cents. Or play around with whatever sounds good. Yeah, whatever timing sounds most natural, right? This is a very small change, so it shouldn't really need much timing adjustment. Then all of a sudden, you're gonna have a much wider stereo image. And so just listen to this. Obviously this is bad because I'm doing it to the whole mix, but listen to how much more big this mix sounds now that this stereo processing is on here. So obviously, don't pan your drums like that because it sounds awful. The guitar specifically all of a sudden sounds a whole lot bigger and adds way more to this section. So I think in general, you're kind of lacking a lot of that stereo spectrum in this mix, and a little bit more emphasis could be on making sure that you're utilizing all of the space you have available to you. Again, the quieter and less dynamic your mix is, it should be in the middle. The bigger sections should pan more out to the sides in order to actually make it feel big. Feel free to automate that as much as your heart desires, because you can do a lot in shrinking and expanding your mix just with the stereo spread, let alone the actual volume balance that you have as well inside of your automation toolbox. If you appreciated this review, then let me know in the comments down below, what did you find that was helpful inside of this mix review? And then also, if you want access to the Pro Mix formula to get the tools that pro mixing engineers use to get a pro mixes, then make sure you're signing up for that down below. It is completely free to you for watching this video. Appreciate you for engaging with this content. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.